Hello, and welcome to the Natchez podcast, the one true chapter by chapter podcast that usually goes through A Song of Ice and Fire one chapter a week and has a usual monthly bonus episode covering something Game of Thrones or Song of Ice and Fire related. But what are those things really? We are not doing that here tonight. I'm one of your hosts, Jeff, better known as Brendan Beefish.
And I'm your other host, Emmett, better known as Poor Quentin.
And welcome to our 9th FEVRE DREAM episode titled River of Blood, in which Abner and Joshua arrive at Natchez, a city just as divided as they are.
Yes, indeed. We're ramping up the tensions and the creepy imagery so wonderfully from the last couple of Abner chapters, and that's going to seg so nicely into chapter 10 when we get back to Sour Billy and Damon Julian and all those nice folks.
Nice is a word. It's a word. It's interesting.
Word, who's to say?
We will find out next week, next month rather, when we actually cover chapter 10 of FEVRE DREAM. But it's not the right word, but it's a great word all the same. But so it's also wonderful in this chapter, and of course this next chapter as well, as we'll be covering next month. So usually, excuse me, do it again. Spoiler warning for, as we say in every episode of FEVRE DREAM, for the first half of the episode, we'll be talking about spoilers up and only up to the end of the 7th to the 8th to the 9th chapter of FEVRE DREAM. From there, we'll give a brief warning that will be transitioned to the second half of the episode where we'll talk about spoilers for anything and everything for FEVRE DREAM. But before we actually get to the synopsis for this episode, as we normally just jump right into it for every single FEVRE DREAM episode, we got a question from someone on our Patreon, from Sir Jonathan B., a sworn sword, who recently sent us a message. And I figure, because this is not my area of expertise, I would ask Emmett this question. So, and you'll see why I'm asking him this question in a moment. He says, "Hey guys, I'm a new patron and a huge fan of FEVRE DREAM, and I'm absolutely loving this first chapter of your series. Thank you. You were talking about names this episode, and I couldn't help myself but wanted to point out two little details that I personally discovered about the name Marsh. The first idea for inspiration is that Captain Marsh is actually a Lovecraftian character from the shadows over Innsmouth. Is it Innsmouth or Innsmouth? I don't know. I'm not
Innsmouth,
again.
I think.
Innsmouth. Okay, cool.
But I pronounce half of everything wrong, so never take me seriously on that count.
America, which I think could have some significance for George, given his inclination for Lovecraftian horror. And the second, more important idea is that during the Civil War era, one of the many names for the blood-sucking mosquito-borne malarial disease was actually Marsh River. I think
Marsh Fever.
Marsh Fever. I think Captain Marsh's FEVRE DREAM is a great hidden reference to blood-sucking vampires in this way. Thanks for the content, and please keep it up." So I figured I'd ask you, sir, how would you respond to this excellent, question/discussion that Sir Jonathan put forward about FEVRE DREAM and what the potential hidden meanings behind it are?
That's an interesting set of associations there, because, okay, you start with the Civil War era, which is most relevant to this book, and the idea of marsh fever and this kind of blood-sucking mosquito-borne disease, and that lines up with so many of the vampiric illusions in FEVRE DREAM. So you think, oh, that's interesting that Abner, who is usually associated with the other side of FEVRE DREAM, not the vampiric side, the resolutely stubborn, moral, fleshy human side, but his name is associated with the blood-sucking side. Well, that speaks to a lot of what George, I think, is trying to get at in FEVRE DREAM, these seeming opposites that actually have a lot in common underneath, and how to cross these bridges for good or ill. And then the Lovecraft layer on top of that is something else entirely, and that's really interesting because there is not, I think, direct Lovecraftian horror going on in FEVRE DREAM, but as we see within elements of A Song of Ice and Fire, including our upcoming 18-part episode series on the Forsaken, that horror means a lot to George and kind of drops it in unexpected areas. So I definitely think he might be drawing from it in terms of trying to evoke an ancient sort of eldritch horror going on with FEVRE DREAM, or the sense of a journey in Lovecraft, and how that kind of gets mirrored in the journey down a river stories of Heart of Darkness or Apocalypse Now or FEVRE DREAM. So I think those are interesting associations. And then of course there's Bowen Marsh in A Song of Ice and Fire, who's not, I think, directly connected to Lovecraftian horror or direct vampirism, but certainly is you could say sucks the blood out of Jon Snow in the Night's Watch a bit. So I think these are not like literal signposts in terms of defining what the character is about, but I think Jonathan B. definitely is on George's breadcrumb trail in terms of the ideas that become associated in his head while writing and the kind of names he wants to throw up as tributes along the way.
Yeah, I think that's great. And of course, George is very inspired by Lovecraft, as he, I believe in 2014, he went up to New York City around the publication of The World of Ice and Fire, and of course visited H.P. Lovecraft's grave. And there's an article in Vulture magazine, I want to say, where he's standing over it and stuff like that, and doing his little bit in order to pay his homage and honor to H.P. Lovecraft, who again was a horrible person as an actual person, but apparently a very good author. I've never actually read his stuff. Is it worth reading H.P. Lovecraft, do you think?
I think it is in like a kind of academic historical sense, because so much comes from it in terms of style and just the images, and any kind of story that tries to riff on cosmic horror, or pull out and zoom out and see there's things beyond your grasp. That's a huge influence on pop culture, and it is wild to kind of follow that back to the source. Most of them are not really compelling as spooky bedtime stories, or whatever you might think they're supposed to be. I think they are interesting in the history of horror, but I would not recommend them to someone as a way of getting into horror. Once they're hooked, once someone is into the scope of horror, then you start showing them directly Lovecraft. But you watch Alien and Aliens first if you want a more pop culture accessible way of getting at the imagery and themes of Lovecraft.
I've seen those, so I think we're on the right track for myself.
I think you're good.
Okay, I don't have to read Lovecraft. I don't have to read it all because I never read.
Perfect.
Can't read. So thank you, Sir Jonathan B., for the excellent comment and question. Normally I would say if you guys want to submit questions to us about Fever Dream, you're welcome to, although I've never said that before. But yeah, if you guys have stuff you want to bring up to our attention about Fever Dream, upcoming chapters, episode themes, stuff like that, feel free to hit us up on patreon.com/nauticast_ASOF. And hell, we'll make it for poor fellows and above, since you guys are the ones who are all listening to these episodes. So if you want to send us something, absolutely feel free, and we would love to see your guys' thoughts about this series. But enough about Patreon, enough about our questions. Again, thank you, Sir Jonathan, for that question. Let's get on to the synopsis for Fever Dream Chapter 9. Last month, we talked about aboard the Fever Dream. Last month was aboard the steamer Fever Dream, in which Joshua did some strange things that Abner was a little uncomfortable with, especially when he saw blood on his hands at the end of that chapter. So let's find out what happens to Joshua and Abner in this synopsis of Chapter 9 of Fever Dream. Aboard the steamer Fever Dream, Mississippi River, August 1857. It's a new month aboard the Fever Dream, and boy, things are not going well. First, there was the tedium. They should have made it down the river from St. Louis to New Orleans in less than a month and made it back, even with stops and freight aboard. But now it was going to take them more than a month to even reach New Orleans. It seemed to Abner Marsh as if the weather, the river, and Joshua York himself were all conspiring to slow them down. There was the thick fog that laid over the river for 2 days that Dan Albright tried to steer through, and that had Abner all in a mess of nerves. But even Albright had to throw in the towel after a while of trying to get through the fog. They put in at Memphis and watched the brown rivers flow by. They also saw a raft come down the river on fire, but they couldn't help them. Finally, the fog lifts just enough for Carl Friend to judge it just safe enough to move out. But an hour later, they end up coming onto a sandbar, and it takes them 3 hours to edge their way around the sandbar with all the crew unloaded on the side of the river. Coast is clear, right? No, not after that. A thunderstorm strikes 3 days later, and the Fever Dream traverses slowly down through all the snares of the river. And boy, there's a lot. Chutes and cutoffs, boats coming from around the bend unknown, a dark river with no moon or starlight. The Fever Dream moves on and on and on, but they often had to tie up. And they often had to tie up often to stay safe. But it wasn't all bad news, right? Joshua York was up in the pilot house learning the trade. I told him right off that a night like that wasn't no good, Fram said to Marsh one evening over dinner. I couldn't learn them marks that I couldn't really see myself, could I? Well, that man's got the damnedest eyes for the darkness I ever seen. There's times I swear he's seeing right into the water, and it ain't nothing to him but how black it gets. I keep him by me and tell him the marks, and 9 times out of 10, he sees them before I do. Last night, I think I would have tied her up halfway through the dog watch, but for Joshua. However, much as Joshua York was doing good by the boat, he was also delaying the progress. He made 6 landings in small towns on the way down the river. Twice he was gone all night. Then he was gone to Napoleon for 3 days, Vicksburg for 4 days. It was intolerable. But hey, good news again. When they finally make it out of Vicksburg, the sunset was beautiful. The clouds were real pretty, looking fiery red, and the waters are clear and calm as Abner describes them looking out over his river. It's just a beautiful evening. Let's let Abner describe it. No stars come out, and Abner thinks about going. Excuse me. Kind of missed my mark there. So Abner describes the river as looking like blood, starting with red blood in the morning, red blood in the afternoon, dark red blood in the evening, and then blood as like a grave at night. It's a real eerie scene. And Abner, that's how you're describing your perfect night? Okay. So no stars come out, and Abner thinks about going down to dinner with blood on his mind. Yikes. Abner thinks more about what happened back in New Madrid from last chapter. He hadn't done anything about it, but he was sure he had seen something there. He just wasn't exactly sure what he had seen. Maybe it was that Joshua cut himself while he was out gallivanting around the woods. Yeah, that's a ticket. But then why was Joshua being so secretive? Marsh had seen blood before, plenty of it. Fistfights and canings, duels and shootings. The river ran down into slave country and blood flowed easily there for those whose skin was black. The free states weren't so much better. Marsh had been in Bleeding, Kansas for a time, had seen men burned and shot. He had served in the Illinois militia when he was younger and had fought in the Black Hawk War. He still dreamt of times of the Battle of Bad Axe when they cut down Black Hawk's people, women, and children too, as they tried to cross the Mississippi to the safety of the western shore. That had been a bloody day, but needed. Black Hawk had come a warring and a raiding over to Illinois after all. But this time, the bloodletting wasn't done by Abner, but he still felt rather uncomfortable about it. Still, a deal was a deal. He had made a bargain with Joshua, and Abner was honor-bound to maintain his side of the bargain. It didn't matter who the deal was made with. Joshua had said he had enemies, so Joshua was being fair, right, by disappearing? So Abner tries to put the whole thing out of his mind. For now. The problem was that everywhere Abner went, he was reminded of blood. The Mississippi looked like blood. Abner was dreaming of bleeding, and the mood aboard the Fever Dream was growing, quote, bored and somber. A striker grew careless and got scalded by steam. He was set ashore at Napoleon. A roustabout, a black man, fled the ship in Vicksburg. Abner thinks this is crazy given that this place was slave country. Then there were fights aboard the ship, hot and bored. Abner feels like he's being punished. But now Missouri and Tennessee were behind him. Days turned to weeks. Passengers decide to fuck off the Fever Dream, and they don't take on much cargo due to York's forays into the woods. And word was about the towns. Abner disembarked on that the Fever Dream was the ship, that the Fever Dream itself, the ship, was slow, too big, had engine problems, and a possible boiler explosion just on the horizon. Plus, Abner heard news about himself. That he was some up-jumped other riverman trying to fake his way into being a real riverman. Plus, there was talk about Joshua and his queer companions. The Fever Dream was getting a reputation, and it wasn't good. By the time they came steaming to Natchez, Marsh had had quite enough. Whew, Natchez, yeah, this place. Abner hears the bells for landing, and he sees a gaggle of steamers on the landing in front of two cities. Wait, two cities? It's just said Natchez, right? One city? No, two. Yes, there was Natchez on the hill, the upper-class place with the broad streets, flowers, trees, nice houses, and streets with actual names attached to them. Again, upper-class type place, as it was the spot where all the rich folk drank mint juleps and looked down on the poorest from above, literally from above. Also, every male was a colonel of some sort. They were also presumptuous assholes who you had to entertain and bring up onto the deck of the steamer no matter what. But they were a curiously blind bunch. From the great houses on the bluffs, the nabobs looked out over the shining majesty of the river, but somehow they couldn't see the things that were right beneath them. Below Natchez on the hill was Natchez under the hill, and boy, this place. I love this place. Sorry. Few flowers, no marble columns. The streets were unnamed and muddy trails. There were bars and brothels aplenty. Gambling was big here. Everyone drank whiskey or bourbon, hired sex workers. The steamboat men loved and hated Natchez under the hill, Smeagol style. Marsh had spent some time in Natchez under the hill as a young man and remembers it fondly, but he doesn't have a good feeling about it here. Abner considers telling Dan Albright to press on, but then guess what boat shows up? Yep, it's the Eclipse. Remember that boat that's been haunting Abner's mind throughout the entirety of this series? It goes steaming by at top speed, and Abner decides, yes, I absolutely meant to stop here at Natchez under the hill. So he decides to set down, sees the passengers getting ready to land, and the freight being ready to unload, and then he decides against moving on and settling at Natchez. They dock, and the crew gets out, with most of them heading for the Silver Street, where all the brothels and bars are, of course. But Abner stays atop the Texas porch until nighttime. And then Joshua comes up and announces he's going ashore. When Abner asks how long he'll be, Joshua isn't sure. You just need to wait for him. That's all. I'd sooner go with you, Joshua, Marsh said. That's Natchez out there. Natchez under the hill. It's a rough place. We might be waiting here for a month while you lay in some gutter with your throat cut. Let me come with you. Show you around. I'm a riverman. You ain't.
Sorry, 1 sec. Lost my place. Sorry.
You're good.
No, York said. I have business ashore, Abner.
We're partners, ain't we? Your business is my business. Where the Fever Dream is concerned, it's all of our business.
I have concerns beyond our steamboat, friend. Some things you cannot help me with. Some things I must do alone.
Well, Simon goes with you, don't he?
At times, that is different, Abner. Simon and I share certain interests that you and I do not.
Yeah, well, you mentioned enemies once, Joshua. If that's what you're about, taking care of those who wronged you, then tell me. I'll help you.
Joshua York shook his head. No, Abner. My enemies might not be your enemies.
Let me decide that, Joshua. You've been fair with me so far. Trust me, be fair with you.
I cannot, York replied sorrowfully. Abner, we have a bargain. Ask me no questions. Please. Now, if you would, let me pass.
Abner Marsh nodded and moved aside, and Joshua York swept by him and stared down the stairs, and started down the stairs. Joshua, Marsh called out when York was almost to the bottom. The other turned. Be careful, Joshua, Marsh said. Natchez can be bloody.
York stared up at him for a long time, his eyes as gray and unreadable as smoke. Yes, he said finally. I will take care. Then he turned and was gone.
Thank you, as always. If you guys don't know this from if you've never listened to our Fever Dream episodes, Emmett is always playing the part of Joshua in these episodes, and it's great. Everybody's commenting in the chats about you being, which one is creepier, your Jojen voice or your Joshua York voice. And I think they're about similar. The same. Yeah.
And you do a great Abner as always, sir. Thank you.
Wow, I just got to be myself, idiotic and stupid and Southern. Anyways, Abner
and Southern. That's where the acting comes in.
That's right. Abner watches Joshua go ashore, and when he gets out of eyeshot, he heads towards the captain's cabin. He gets a key out. He hesitates for a moment before putting the key in. It was a spare. You see, it was just common procedure to have spare keys made. Besides, people died in locked cabins all the time. Better to have a spare key, right? He's rationalizing people. That's what he's doing here. Abner considers that partners had to trust each other, and now Abner was breaking that trust. Joshua would never trust him again, but he stills himself, turns the key, and then enters. He lights a lamp and moves around trying to find clues as to what Joshua is up to. He finds old newspapers, tons of newspapers actually, from all over the country, from big cities to small towns. A number of these papers had stories cut out from them. Then he finds 2 ledger books, and then nervous as all get out, he thinks he might find diary entries. Instead, he finds only cut-out newspaper articles with dates labeled next to them. Lots of stories about bodies, mysterious murders. He turns to the other book and finds much the same. Page after page of bodies, mysterious deaths, corpses discovered here and there, all arranged by city. Marsh closed the books and returned them to their place and tried to consider. The newspapers had lots of accounts of deaths and killings that York hadn't bothered to cut out. Why? He searched through a few newspapers and read them over until he was sure. Then Marsh frowned. It appeared that Joshua had no interest in shootings or knifings, in rivermen drowned or blown up by boiler explosions or burned, in gamblers and thieves hanged by the law. The stories he collected were different. Deaths no one could account for. Folks with throats tore out. Bodies all mutilated and ripped up, or else too far rotted for anyone to know just how they died. Bodies unmarked as well, found dead for no reason anyone could find. Found with wounds too small to notice at first. Found whole, but bloodless. In total, it was 50 to 60 stories with 9 months of deaths recounted. Abner wonders if this was Marsh keeping tabs on his own murders, but as he thinks over, he realizes that's probably not the case. Joshua had been with Abner for a number of these murders in another part of the country, but still, why? What was Abner after? Was he chasing an enemy like he talked about with Abner back in the day? But then Abner realizes that all of these deaths couldn't be the work of one singular enemy. Besides, Joshua said enemies in the first chapter. And then Joshua had come back from New Madrid with blood on his hands, and he was still out there. It makes no sense to Abner. So Abner goes through Joshua's room, his clothes, his papers, his quills, his writing implements. He finds nothing of interest. He did find a note from a banker who told Joshua about Abner Marsh, telling Joshua that Abner would be amenable to the offer that Joshua might make him. But he already knew all that. Finding nothing useful beyond Joshua's drink, books on poetry, history, natural science, and alchemy, he did find one book with a gold leaf paper, but it was written in a spindly code and not Joshua's handwriting. He goes through one last time in the cabin trying to find something, and he doesn't. So he gets out, closes the door behind him, knowing he is none the wiser than when he came. It was cool outside, and Abner knew that he was drenched in sweat. He slipped the key back into his coat pocket and turned to go, and stopped. A few yards away, the ghastly old woman, Catherine, was standing and staring at him, cold malevolence in her eyes. Marsh decided to brazen it out. He tipped his cap. Good evening, ma'am, he said to her. Catherine smiled, slowly, a creeping brightness of a smile that twisted her vulpine face into a mask of terrible glee. Good evening, Captain, she said. Her teeth, Marsh noted, were yellow and very long. And that is chapter 9 of Fever Dream. Eerie, aggravated, moody, suspenseful. This chapter runs the emotional gamut. What did you think of this chapter, man?
Chapter 9, The Fever Dream has officially arrived in the southern half of the Mississippi, the fairy tale kingdom of Damon Julian, in contrast to the mundane mortal world of Abner Marsh, with Joshua York in between, a foot in each world. The change is writ all over this chapter in ways large and small. It applies to Abner's relationship to Joshua, strained more than ever, even as they still find ways of connecting and preserving their bond. It applies to our new setting of Natchez, strictly divided between two different cities, two different worlds. And it applies to the imagery of the river turning slowly into black blood. There's no turning back now.
Yeah, you're right about that. We keep flowing down farther and farther, sinking almost. You could feel it as we're going south in this journey of Abner's. And again, I like to think that George looked at the creative process of writing and built a plot around it, essentially. We've all been there. We're going through a terrific bout of writing, speeding through chapters, writing our way through twists and turns of the narrative, and then a mental fog hits. We're left cloudy, piecemealing our way through a sentence or two at a day, or sometimes being unable to churn out a single word. And then the writing pace quickens back up again. All is saved, but then we steam into a place we feel real fucking wrong about, and we're left wondering whether this is the direction that we want to be in or want to go. And this is kind of actually the way that George described writing A Dance with Dragons back in like 2007, 2008, and how all of those rewriting delays came as the result of him getting waylaid by the writing process, by his own writing process. It's a terrific framework, I think, to actually build. It's a terrific framework to build the house of this chapter upon, because boy, this chapter has a lot of plot and character built against it.
That's a terrific point. I mean, you have the river as kind of a metaphor for writing and for reading, for those journeys you take through a book to reach your kind of climax and release at the end. And this chapter does kind of have a lot of weights built against it, a lot of kind of tensions building on our characters' shoulders. Right from the start of this chapter, we get a sense of how the, quote, tedious schedule is itching away under Abner's skin, motivating him to cross the line with Joshua later in the chapter. Abner, the lifelong man of labor, is only happy when he's got every detail of the day mapped out in his head. So he knows how long it should take them to reach New Orleans, even allowing for some delays, as you must on the river. Yet the Fever Dream is lagging far behind that pace, and George emphasizes that there is more than one reason why. Fog hangs heavy for long periods of time, forcing them to find harbor and wait, which is just extremely frustrating for everybody, because again, Abner's only happy when he's working. Even when it's not foggy, the nights are dark and overcast, easily leading to snags and accidents and further delays. Abner standing there fuming, watching his men waste their energy and time in ways that's not getting them downriver, and the river just keeps going past him, seeming to like laugh at him. Joshua continues to delay the Fever Dream most every step of the way. His stops ranging from towns to wood yards to a private wharf. The full gamut of society, also frustrating Abner's attempts to figure out what's going on. There's no real pattern to it other than he's making them wait. As a result, the ship loses crew, passengers, and worst of all, reputation. The most vital currency on the river, and it can't be replaced easily like crew or passengers. It deeply wounds Abner to hear the negative gossip about his ship, that it's a white elephant, a dandy, an eyesore, or that it's fine, but he's the problem. And the last one hurts so badly because at some level, Abner has to be wondering whether this is true. Not really that he's caused the delay out of incompetence. True, he's new on this half of the river, but I don't think that's his main concern. What his concern is that by making this bargain with Joshua, Abner is responsible for poisoning the ship. And Joshua doesn't really seem to care. Abner thinks it's as if the river and the weather are conspiring with Joshua to slow him down. And this perfectly captures Abner's dark, troubled mood at the moment. He feels a connection he cannot explain, a conspiracy closing around him composed of elemental factors as much as human agency. People are fighting on his ship. They're deserting. Even the eclipse is catching up, the ultimate mockery for him. It's all falling apart. And he pins it on Joshua, not really because that's rational, but because that's the one thing he can still try to explain and understand.
It's great because it's subtext here, but there's this line that Abner thinks in this chapter where he thinks about him being judged by something for And judged for what? He doesn't actually say it because the subtext, he thinks he's being judged for his silence, for what he witnessed in the last chapter, I think is what was actually going on in Abner's mind. And I do love the fact that those fits and starts that occupy the first quarter or so of this chapter in sailing through the fog, this also mirrors what's happened between Abner and Joshua's relationship. Recall that in the first meeting between Abner and Joshua, Abner remembers the fog and the ice sheet that broke his hopes and dreams back in the day. And he's thinking and seeing Joshua and looking at this guy, and he's seeing the same ice, that same fog that could pull him under. And Abner thinks somewhere in the fog, Marsh could sense the ice moving slow, so slow. And he could hear the awful splintering of his boats and all his hopes. And now it's a literal, not metaphorical fog, paralleling how Abner is feeling about the journey with Joshua so far. The progress of this chapter is interrupted time after time after time. And because the fever dream itself is a character in the books, it is basically the third major character in the story, it feels as if the boat's character progression is lost and unable to move forward. It's staying in stasis from the last chapter. It's not been able to progress beyond that. And as you point out, the boat is getting a bad rep of no fault of its own. It's not like the fever dream did anything wrong yet. It's not as though the fever dream conjured up the fog and all the stops that Joshua York is ordering up. Did it now? I don't think so.
Exactly right. And Abner feels so connected to the boat and tied to it, not only economically, but also in terms of it being his baby. And he feels like, Joshua, you're just using it to get to these secret missions, which seem to be your real purpose after all. Is that all we were to you, me and this boat? And that he feels used in a way. And yet Joshua's position in all this is not simply that of a villain. Even as George ratchets up the tension between our central characters, he maintains Joshua's ambiguity so as to preserve his essentially good intentions through later reveals. When the fever dream is facing mundane obstacles, Joshua proves to be of great help. His night vision keeps the ship afloat in tight corners, so to speak. And you can see the metaphor at work. Joshua has sailed metaphorical dark waters inside and out, so he can help their ship through literal dark waters. And this is the partnership working as intended, both Abner and Joshua bringing their different skills to bear. Joshua showing good faith in crossing over and learning. But Joshua also continues to go ashore for long stretches, slowing them down. And Abner's feelings about this now extend beyond annoyance to dread. He saw blood on Joshua's hands. Nothing can erase it from his mind, just as nothing can erase it from Joshua's. It disturbs him more than the delays themselves, which are baked into the cake to a certain extent. Even though Joshua is helping get the fever dream through the fog and the darkness, Abner still feels that Joshua is allied with these forces somehow because he's not being honest and because he seems to be violent. The blood is the one detail in the whirligig contraption that is the fever dream that makes Abner feel not in control, uncertain, scared, foreign in his home. It's a feeling that digs deep, leaving him alienated from the fabric of his environment, both natural and man-made, needing to restore himself somehow. And George captures this in one of the most lyrical and beautiful passages in the book, in which the loveliness of the setting sun brings Abner no comfort. All he can see is what the setting sun, the passage of time, the arrival of night, does to the water, the river, the source of his livelihood. The setting sun turns the water to blood, and then turns the blood to dried blood, and then the dried blood to black blood, which Abner thinks of as the color of death. That's the entire arc of Fever Dream, in both personal and political terms captured in imagery. The river of life, the wellspring of meaning and joy in Abner's life specifically, is irrevocably tainted by bloodletting, and beyond that by death, which is signaled by the transformation of blood to black, which evokes the specific bloodletting of black people in America, especially in the southern world Abner is entering now. Abner's world, Abner's country, is built on blood. The river runs on and on, washing everything clean. Everything is transient. Everything is replaceable. Everything dies. And that's how he feels about the bloodletting he's seen and taken part in before, that it was just part of the flow of life, part of the history of the country. As awful as violence is, it's swept up in time and nature, just like love. I recently rewatched the American classic film Badlands, the debut of Terrence Malick. All his films deal with this idea of transience in nature, the duality of angel and beast contained within man. Martin Sheen's seductive serial killer in Badlands is compared to an asylum patient wearing half a tux, like someone who's beyond the pale, who's still kind of half pretending he's, just a regular folk. And that's Joshua York too. But some blood can't be washed away. And Abner believes the blood on Joshua's hands to be that kind, different somehow from the blood he's seen spilled before. This process of understanding, making this distinction, a gradual dawning of consciousness by which home becomes a mass grave in your eyes, is cued by the setting of the sun, counting down Abner to darkness and death, the return and final victory of that ice jam on the river you were talking about. Abner intends to hold to his bargain in the face of such troubling signs because to him, a man's word is what holds this fallen world together in the face of entropy. Even with the devil himself, even with a killer disguised as your partner, even with a man trying to wash the blood off his hands, you hold to your bargains.
That's right, buddy. Preacher sharper the devil himself, as he thinks in this chapter. Abner is going to hold to every deal he's signed on to. To me, it feels covenantal. Abner isn't a religious guy, as he says over and over in the story, but the way he holds to bargains feels almost like the covenant that Abraham and God made, and when they swore their deal in the desert, that God would be their God and Abraham would be a part of his people and father all of the people, all of God's people. And like that covenant of old, Abner's covenant with Joshua revolves around one commonality: blood. But the question that Abner keeps turning over in his mind is whether he's becoming a co-conspirator to whatever Joshua's doing out in the woods and the towns he's been ordered to stop at. We covered this last month when we did chapter 8, but Abner's silence in the matter can only extend so far, and you could feel that tension kind of just going over and over in his mind. Is Joshua a murderer? Has he shed the blood of the guilty or the innocent? Does this make Abner culpable, and by maintaining his side of his side by his silence? What is actual Abner's moral culpability in this? I mean, it's kind of weirdly, and I was thinking about this, it's kind of weirdly like the Golden Company from Dance breaking the contract because of the older contract. This time, the older contract not being, of course, to cede a Blackfriar to the Iron Throne. This one being the social contract, which is not to murder people. You know, that seems to be part of the older contract than actually maintaining your word. These are the questions that form around Abner as the steamboat pulls into a city whose gutters literally overflow with blood. My favorite spot in Fever Dream.
Yes, everything we've been talking about so far, duality, dishonesty, blood, devils, and angels, comes together in our new setting, that is, the two cities of Natchez. George describes them to us in such a way that makes perfectly clear Abner's perspective on both halves of the city, how they relate to the imagery and themes of the chapter so far, and how Joshua is likely to fit in or not. Natchez on the hill is the proper city, according to Abner. Proper in the sense both that it's, well-to-do and rich, but also in the sense that it's somehow the real city because it's well-to-do and rich. It is, quote, lofty and precipitous, perched above the world, looking down on it arrogantly. Its streets are broad, its houses are grand, and everything has its own name, speaking to both the self-regard and attention to detail and history of its inhabitants. Everything must be in its right place to honor the ancestors we soon will join. These are palaces, according to Abner. Their inhabitants are kings. In other words, they represent European power structures smuggled into the supposedly new populist democratic American dream, the old world found haunting the new at every turn, sucking it dry. They are also called nababs, a term for Englishmen who reaped vast fortunes in India, usually via the privately held East India Company. Both of these framings apply to Damon Julian and his followers, and they also apply to Joshua York, whether he likes it or not. These petty kings of the Mississippi lay about with their drinks and their pets, fighting each other with the slightest opportunity, demanding respect everywhere they go. Abner doesn't feel at home here, because he's a true American. He feels more at home in Natchez under the hill, the exact opposite world in every sense. The red world. No marble, no flowers, no carefully preserved beauty, no sense of history carted over from Europe. Everything is dust in Natchez under the hill, including you if you're not careful. Even the streets are caving in. Everything is doomed. This stands in marked contrast to the aura up the hill of a super-terrestrial twilight, to borrow from the Age of Innocence, where winter never comes. The Underhill City, which may be borrowed from Lord of the Rings, is a hive of scum and villainy, where everything is for sale, but everything is also a ripoff. Temptation and punishment go hand in hand. It's hell, clearly. But does that necessarily make the city up the hill heaven? Well, the residents certainly think so. And they have many advantages, and they have easy living that the downtrodden do not. But they don't seem to have gained access to the treasure of heaven, the true point. Wisdom, enlightenment, acceptance of one's small place in the cosmos, and glorying in being part of it all. What we are seeing with the two Natchezes is a split between head and body, superego and id, between inner and outer faces, and of course, between the worlds of Abner Marsh and Joshua York. These two are incomplete without the other. Those atop the hill ignore and exploit those below, and this must change. When Abner tries to warn off Joshua about the Underhill city, he tells his partner that it's bloody. Well, very telling choice of words, given the blood on Joshua's hands. Well, maybe he belongs in the Undertown after all, despite having the aesthetic and temperament of someone from up the hill. Perhaps we're seeing a blurring between these worlds.
And perhaps the blurring is occurring in the town itself, and that they're both built on blood. I mean, Natchez under and over the hill is basically the story of America writ small. Much as the concept in Fever Dream is microcosm for the soul of the American Republic, and vampirism works as a metaphor for slavery, Natchez works in so many levels to represent the America that was and continues. I mean, America is a city on the hills pilgrims have visited, set aside from their European contemporaries. And then it operates as an actual city on a hill, which separates classes in America. America is also born fighting, as former Virginia Senator Jim Webb put it, about the Scotch-Irish existence in the southern part of the United States. It's ruffians and poor whites who fled the border region between northern England and Scotland and settled in this part of the world, bringing their rough and tumble ways with them. But the one commonality between both of these worlds, as I was indicating before, is blood. Natchez is bloody. The historical Natchez was the main thoroughfare for the cotton trade, which flowed from all of the slave plantations in the southern part of the United States and then worked its way up north. So the North was benefiting from the slave trade during this time, taking all of the blood that was being shed in the South in order to reap economic rewards and benefits for its people in the North. Natchez is bloody. The economic lifeblood of the city was found on the blood of Black Americans who were deprived of compensation for their labor, to put it very, very mildly, way too mildly, actually. Blood shed red in the streets and washed out in alleyways and Natchez under the hill, and the blood of the slaves owned by the aristocracy above the hill. It reflects that blood price that Natchez pays for its prominence and what America paid for its rise to prominence in the 1800s.
Very well said, sir. And it's a structure that has to be constantly unaware of itself. Not to get all, crude Marxist with you, but there's the idea that all, big institutions under a given economic system will express the contradictions of that system, right? Whatever a given economic system is, whatever the bullshit is, whatever the lie is, whatever the shell game involved in the economic system is, every big institution is going to express that somehow. And I think we're seeing that with Natchez, that the prosperity and ease of the life of the people up above depends on them not just exploiting the people down below them, but just kind of pretending they're not real and not there. And the same goes mutually, despite the fact that George is pointing out the absurdity of that by the fact that they have the same name. They're the same city. They're the same people. Why are they pretending otherwise? This is absurd. This is a contradiction that has to be resolved. There must be a dialectic to produce the new man, blah, 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 blah. And again, not saying that you have to interpret this through a Marxist lens, but I think there is something to a very dialectical approach to Fever Dream, where George is smashing these two ideals together and struggling to find something new coming out of them. And this is very clearly trying to reference what's going on with Abner and Joshua, even though Abner and Joshua are now kind of done interacting in this chapter, because of course the climax of the chapter is Abner breaking the bargain with Joshua, what he said he wouldn't do. He's crossing the line between the Natchezes. It's heartbreaking to watch Abner make the decision to ignore the terms of his bargain with Joshua, but George makes you understand why he's doing it. As far as he's concerned, Joshua has already betrayed the bargain, not with his violence necessarily, but with his silence, dishonesty, and his failure to trust Abner with what's going on. After all, Abner is able to convince himself repeatedly that Joshua's cause might be just, that there are reasons worth spilling blood. And that concept comes up again regarding the political big picture later in the book when we're talking about the Civil War and the aftermath of it. It is Joshua's insistence on not taking Abner into his confidences that leads Abner to enter Joshua's cabin without his permission. Why should Abner owe Joshua that respect when it is not being given to him? And so Abner slowly works his way through Joshua's belongings, focused on all matters of text, letters, journals, newspaper articles. George compared sailing the river to reading a book earlier in Fever Dream, and that same metaphor is at work here. This is the river of Joshua's performed identity as a rich European dandy, which is slowly going to fall apart as we go down south, but is only hinting at the deeper waters here of who he really is. And just as Abner is in new territory with the river south of Cairo, he is lost amidst this river of text because text is not generally how Abner defines himself. He, amidst all this text, can only recognize a description of himself in the mirror, a description of Abner that led Joshua to him, focused on his ugliness, his fairness, and his need for funding. And I love the contrast between describing Abner as both ugly and fair. The latter refers to Abner's sense of right and wrong, of course, but fair also means pretty. So is George sneakily saying that Abner is beautiful where it counts on the inside? Well, Joshua York certainly comes to think so. You could really say the whole book kind of hinges on that. It is Abner's need financially in the wake of the ice jam, however, his need to restore his finances and reputation that really made him such an attractive target for Joshua and binds him to Joshua still, despite all the mysteries and frustrations. Again, one of the things I like about Fever Dream is how focused it is on labor, and it's not making kind of a big, metaphor point about it, but it is Abner's decisions and his frustrations and fears and desires are constantly constrained by the fact that it really does kind of work for Joshua. Like they're partners in name only when it comes to the finances. Like it doesn't really matter what he's found out here. He still needs Joshua to keep this thing going, and he hasn't found enough that would make it worth it to break the deal. And then he leaves, and then he gets spotted by Catherine. There's that kind of horrible, visceral horror moment where he's caught, not by Joshua, as you might expect, but by someone else. When you think about it, Abner learned nothing by breaking his bargain and wound up getting caught in the process. And that's why you have to keep your word, folks. What goes around comes around. Abner didn't end up changing the relationship, and now he's ended up making it much worse. And I think there's kind of a karmic sting in the tail that, Abner, if you hadn't gone in the cabin, you'd know just as much, which is to say nothing, except you wouldn't be in trouble now.
It's so, I mean, welcome to the Not a Cast Fable, moral fable portion of this episode. But yes, keep your word all the time. It's excellent words of wisdom from Emmett, and of course, what this chapter brings out. I think, like, you brought this up several times, and I love this point. You keep bringing it up, but about how Joshua is so much like representing this European aristocratic viewpoint on how labor is supposed to function. I provide you the money, you do all the shit work. Come on, we have an agreement here. And Abner has this very American understanding. Like, you could see why this chapter features Natchez under and over the hill, because we're seeing the side of America. Excuse me, we're seeing the side of this city that is more Joshua style. We're seeing the side of the city that is more Abner style. And, they talk about like every man is a colonel on top of the hill, but underneath of the hill, every man will cut your throat as soon as they get as quick as spit. And that's like interesting. I don't think Abner's not villainous at all, but I think he does have that mentality of being willing to do work that Joshua won't and can't. So when he goes into this cabin, I think it's fascinating that what he sees here is books that he doesn't understand: history, alchemy, science, medicine. He will find out about all these books later on, as we're going to discover in the story. But they don't have any meaning to him. They don't have any ascribed meaning to him. And as we talk about every single time we're talking about these Fever Dream episodes, it's not as though that York is all the way wrong and Abner's all the way right. I think that's an easy way to kind of lean into, is that both men need to meet in the middle. And I think, without spoiling it too much, I think that they will.
Perfectly said, sir. It's coming to that core between them, that bridge they can build that the villain of the story thinks is impossible and has no interest in any way, and seems to be impossible in a larger political story, and that becomes the overall point of Fever Dream, and very emotionally so at the climax. Mm-hmm. So, shifting now into parallels with A Song of Ice and Fire, this foggy river journey to a brutally divided city, it feels like it comes back with interest in Tyrion's chapters in A Dance with Dragons going down the Rhoyne to Volantis. And the more we read Fever Dream, the more it really seems like that Rhoyne journey in Tyrion's chapters in Dance was George deliberately directly riffing on this older novel of his, that he was calling back on Fever Dream as to the general kind of tone and temperament and structure of that journey.
Right. And I definitely see that. And I'm also seeing some inspiration, too, from a later Tyrion chapter where they're sailing on to Marine, allegedly, and they end up getting waylaid when the Selisori Quran ends up getting kind of left lifeless on the water with no winds all around them. Everyone's bored and fighting aboard the ships and the decks of the ship until, of course, the storm comes up on the boat and they think that they're saved until, again, the slave ship comes up and they're not saved after all. But they do get to Marine after all. So Makora was right. That's ultimately my takeaway from this chapter.
Yes, George likes his twisty narrative journeys, and you can do that so easily on boats, showing up where they're supposed to and where they're not. And that happens a couple times with the Fever Dream in terms of ironic arrivals and departures in terms of its destinations. Something else that came to mind when I was reading through this here chapter is that this kind of serial killer-esque record of deaths and atrocities that Abner finds in the newspapers, that this is something that comes up a couple times in George's writing, this interest in serial killers. It's not really a focus, but it's hovering in the background. And in terms of A Song of Ice and Fire, who it really feels like is Ramsay. Like this list of kind of atrocities wherever he goes. You could very much imagine him in modern times. There would be newspaper articles about what he's done.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting. I was recently I don't play video games anymore, but I was watching a YouTube series of the Telltale Game of Thrones games, which do feature Ramsay Bolton as one of the main characters, carving a pathway of murder and horror through the northern part of Westeros after the Red Wedding. So I do think that this is a really interesting way that we kind of getting these stories about these things. We're not quite able to put them together as we see in it's in the court of the merman's court, where one of the peoples at one of the locks comes out and says, we've heard terrible stories about this Ramsay guy, but we don't have it all the way confirmed, and we only learn a little bit about it, or other people from the story only learn a little bit about it from characters like Wex and people who are witnesses there. But I think he will be exposed ultimately in The Winds of Winter, which of course is coming out next week.
Absolutely. It's different in this case because it's a somewhat more modern media environment. So the killer is hidden, but the deaths themselves are kind of exposed because there was just, we have journalists writing about it. Whereas in the Ramses case, it's flipped. Everyone knows who the perpetrator is, but his exact deeds are hidden because it's a pretty modern environment.
Mm-hmm. So this whole idea about the river of blood, right? That light playing on the river and it's reminding Abner of blood is an idea we see a lot in A Song of Ice and Fire. I think the most prominent example that we see is Makoro's vision of Euron Greyjoy from Tyrion's 8th chapter of Dance with Dragons, where Makoro says that he only sees their shadows, one most of all, a tall and twisted thing with one black eye and 10 long arms sailing on a sea of blood. Of course, it's just a river of blood here, so it's gotten a little bit worse come A Song of Ice and Fire. It's only a river back in the day, the 80s. Now
it's grown.
Well, fucking blood. Yeah,
it's graduated. It went through a training montage, like in Rocky IV. But yeah, that's a great connection. That's something I think George likes because water is supposed to be this symbol of transformation and being fluid, and your identity shifts and your reflection. And then when you make it a sea of blood, it's become like this traumatic space and traumatic transformation. That's definitely what's going on with Euron. And I think you can see it here. It's not just that something horrible is happening; it's that the space of restoration and life and meaning for Abner, the river, as is the sea for Aeron Damphair. Both of these are being turned to blood, turned to horror, and that transformation is what horrifies them so much. Finally, in terms of A Song of Ice and Fire parallels, there is mention made that the upper class on Natchez on the Hill use hunting bears in their sport. It's a throwaway line, but this may have been the literary forebear for George to the Vargo Hope Bear in the pit at Harrenhal that we see being wielded at the end of A Clash of Kings and then paid off in full in A Storm of Swords, Jaime VI, when he saves Brienne from it.
Yes, I just saw this as a kind of interesting line that George might have used back in the day and saw it. They were using bears apparently to hunt, which I'm not sure how that's actually done, you would use an actual live bear to hunt. But then, of course, that bear becomes into... How do you actually do that? I have no idea.
Carefully, I hope.
Very carefully, yes. Who the fuck knows how to do that? Oh, well, it's all good. George definitely pays it off come Storm Swords Jaime VI. So that about wraps it up for A Song of Ice and Fire Parallels. If you guys are listening through with us chapter by chapter, month by month, we're going to be switching over to foreshadowing groundwork. So we will be going through spoilers all for the rest of Fever Dream. And that begins in 3, 2, 1. Okay, guys, of course, Catherine's teeth are yellow and very long. She's a vampire. Come on. Duh.
Yeah, it's a nice horror sting at the end of the chapter. Again, it's a great switcheroo because who you were expecting to see is Joshua, right? That's who you're expecting to catch Abner kind of instinctively as a reader. So the fact that it's Catherine throws you off, so that's enough. So it all just feels kind of like this skin crawling image, and it's just like it's this image of horror and corruption. It's just a wonderful way to end the chapter. It's great. I love it.
Oh, it's so good. Yeah.
So the letter that Abner reads from Joshua's banker mentions that Abner is an honest man, but exceedingly ugly. Joshua likely chose Abner so he wouldn't be tempted to kill him. Recall from the first Daemon chapter about how excited Daemon was at killing the beautiful girl that Sourbilly purchased from New Orleans, and how horrifically aroused he'll be as he contemplates killing a Creole girl in the very next chapter. So again, this is like this reversal where all Daemon cares about is surface beauty. He doesn't care about the person inside because he doesn't really think of them as a person. He's just going to kill them. Whereas for Joshua, he wants someone who's physically ugly to deal with his temptation, but he also wants someone who's fair on the inside, as I was saying about Abner, who has strength of character and will be a good partner to him. That's what makes Joshua and Daemon such good contrasts.
Right. I mean, when we talk about another Song of Ice and Fire parallel, we will explore this more in depth next month. But Daemon to me feels very much like a forebear to the others, and that he's not interested in life. He's like just interested in destroying life and destroying. You want to see something beautiful destroyed, which is why he's always targeting those who have a physical attractiveness to them. And that's really, I think that's a really interesting and kind of terrifying character that kind of exceeds beyond just vampires killing beautiful people because for whatever reason, because of the sexual allure of them. There's a definite component of that, but the stronger component for me is the destruction of something beautiful, and that's the main driving motivation for Damon Julian, which makes him so much more terrifying. And I think it's interesting that Joshua attempts to mitigate his own temptation for this. He realizes that this is something that he feels inside, which is because Joshua himself is a bit of a parallel to Damon Julian, though he's able to supersede some of the temptation that Damon Julian has eventually. It took him a couple hundred years, but eventually got through to it. But anyways, moving on from that, this chapter leads us to believe that all of the newspaper clippings that Joshua has him tracing enemies to kill. But the reality is that Joshua isn't interested in bringing the killers to justice or hunting vampires, as he'll later claim to Abner in just a few chapters. Rather, he wants to gather all of the vampires under his leadership and redeem them from their blood-sucking, killing ways and become their Pale King, the basically is the Azor Ahai of Fever Dream for all of these vampires.
Well, this is kind of the spiritual equivalent of the economic idea I was talking about earlier about resolving these contradictory parts into a single unified whole. And that's what Joshua wants to do with his people. He doesn't want to destroy them. He wants to redeem them. He wants to bring them back to the light. He wants to, it's you can see the martyrdom and the Christian symbolism there in terms of what Joshua wants to accomplish. And it's a different idea than Abner's instinct, and both Joshua and Abner kind of have to understand each other at this philosophical level as well as a kind of, we're a different species level, which is the most direct way they have to cross this bridge. But there's so many different kinds of bridges to cross, and that's what's part of what makes Fever Dream so great.
Mm-hmm. So that about wraps us up for our foreshadowing economic portion. Switching over to theory and discussion. So there's a brief mention in this chapter about two historical events, namely Bleeding Kansas and the Black Hawk War. So we figured we would talk about them and try and tie all of those historical events that are mentioned here and Abner's part that he plays in both of these to what actually happens in this chapter and what extrapolations we can get from the story about the narrative that is the United States of America. So to talk a little bit about Bleeding Kansas. So this was a conflict that occurred from 1854 to 1861, and it was a conflict over whether the Kansas Territory would join the Union as a slave state or a free state. Although there were lots of various complications involved in this fight. It wasn't strictly slave versus free. And it's all just really complicated history. But the conflict starts with the idea of whether to bring Kansas into the Union as a slave or free state. So it starts with the Missouri Compromise made that all states above the 30 north parallel are all slave-free, minus the state of Missouri, which is the Missouri Compromise. And then the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1850 created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. But whether Kansas would come into the Union as a slave or free state was up for discussion as Kansas fell north of the 3630 North Parallel, but Southern legislators refused to admit Kansas unless it came in as a slave state. So there were dueling free and slave assemblies, political assemblies, accusations of illegitimacy in government, voter fraud, etc. Does this sound familiar? It should. I'm condensing like a lot of history here just to make one final point, and that it all kind of ended in violence. Bleeding Kansas is the precursor to the American Civil War. It's the microcosm to what would be a nationwide war over the fate of the nation, free or slave, north or south. Slave-supporting whites killed abolitionist whites. A lot of prior personal conflicts were overlaid with free Kansas versus slave Kansas. On one side were men from Missouri who flowed into Kansas to create a slave state. And on the other side were free state Northerners, which were actually primarily New Englanders. I thought they would maybe be new, like Illinoisians. Is that how you pronounce their name? Wisconsins? I don't know, whatever. But they're actually New Englanders were a lot of the folks who came into Kansas. They were the kind of free staters who came to create this state as a slave-free state. Then violence really picked up in the summer of 1856 with occasional outbreaks of violence thereafter from 1857 to 1861 and then spread into the Civil War proper. So as best as I could tell, just about this chapter and about what research I was able to do, which is Google searching on it, Abner's potential role in Bleeding Kansas was in smuggling weapons to free staters as steamboats were used almost exclusively for this purpose during this time period. There's not a lot of historical references or information about this, but it seems to be what Abner's purpose in doing what Abner's role potentially is in Bleeding Kansas, because he does say he was there. He said he did see people burned, shot, and killed, and of course bled as well.
As I was just saying, it's all about these two contradictory parts of the whole that need to be brought together that are struggling to be one. You have North and South in America. You have the two cities of Natchez. You have Abner and Joshua and the Fever Dream. And you have Kansas, which exposes the lie that this nation is ever going to be existing half slave, half free. That's what a lot of politicians and mass movements at various levels started to figure out in America around this time, is that the conflict, regardless of how righteous you feel it is inevitable. And that's what Abner starts to gradually realize as we go through the book as well. And it's kind of similar to Joshua's ideal and kind of not, because Joshua does want to bring two contradictory parts into a whole, but he wants to do it through redemption. And Abner ultimately believes that, like it or not, you have to be baptized in blood. That the violence is the only way out of this American contradiction. And you can see that early on in Bleeding Kansas, and the fact that Abner connects this to the blood on Joshua's hands means he senses at some level, oh, that blood is coming back. That wasn't the end I thought it was.
And again, like we were talking about the main episode, like the vampires and stuff like that. It's just it's not a full, but it's a potential metaphor for the slavery in the United States of America and what that actually means, and how certain parts of the United States, mostly the South, was involved in sucking blood out of actual human people in order to sustain their livelihood. Turning to yet another racial conflict in the United States in history, the Black Hawk War of 1832. This was a conflict over the, quote, British band of Native Americans who were led by Chief Black Hawk, who crossed the Mississippi River from the Iowa territories into the state of Illinois. And Chief Black Hawk's intent was to settle his people peacefully in Illinois, but white settlers believed it was an invasion and mobilized militias to confront his band. So, you know where this one ends. Again, there's a lot of complicated history behind the war, but to break it down more simply, there's a Treaty of St. Louis in 1804 that had Sauk and Mescowee tribes, Native American tribes, sell land in Wisconsin and Illinois to the federal government for settlement by white Americans, and they agreed to depart for the Iowa territories. Black Hawk, who was a veteran of the War of 1812, he fought on the British side, hence why his party was called the British Band, wanted to settle his people in the land in Illinois that had previously been sold, as he felt that there was not a congregation of tribal elders that were involved in the original Treaty of St. Louis, so he felt that there was an illegitimate treaty. And he also wanted to probably do this peacefully. Even historians of the time said as much. But white people in Illinois thought this was invasion and mobilized to confront his band. So, again, violence, the war. White militiamen opened fire on Black Hawk's band, but were then defeated in a raid led by Black Hawk and his men. With the militiamen scattered or dead, some of Black Hawk's band led raids against white settlements in Illinois, killing some, to include some civilians. The federal government responded by sending federal troops into the area, which defeated the British band at the Battle of Wisconsin Heights. The Native Americans fell back to the Mississippi, where they attempted to cross the river, but unfortunately, federal troops and militiamen caught up with the British band and fought them in a one-sided battle known as the Battle of Bad Axe, or the Bad Axe Massacre, as many innocents, to include women and children, were killed during this battle, murdered. And this was actually the battle that Abner refers to here as being the one he was involved in, the Battle of Bad Axe, or the Bad Axe Massacre. The aftermath of the Black Hawk War was Indian removal, which forcibly evicted Native Americans from lands east of the Mississippi towards the western part of the United States, and then later, as American history progresses, in the later part of the 19th century, into reservations themselves.
And this is where we get back to Natchez, this forced geographic separation, and the fact that Natchez over the hill is kind of collapsing, the street giving way into nothing. There's not just individual acts of violence here. These individual acts of violence punctuate these larger political and social movements in which entire peoples are removed from their land and sent off elsewhere into exile, into reservation, many of them dwindling into despair and death. And we see that happening in various ways in various communities across the story. And this is the one Abner was involved in a small way, as you say. Certainly Abner wasn't a general. He was probably a spoiler for a part of it. But even that, that small, intimate part of it, Abner starts to feel some responsibility for it.
Right. And I think like the question we have to ask is, why is like Abner thinking about these moments and these historical events? And of course, some of these events are 25 years in the past for Abner, but he was a part of them when it comes to like the Black Hawk War. Abner is going to later like think about the North as being nearly as bad as the South and its use of violence. And he thinks about this in this chapter itself as well. While the North was slave-free by the 1850s, technically, this didn't make the North less prejudiced or prone to violence against ethnic minorities, with much of the violence in the North being dealt to Native Americans in the territories west and east of the Mississippi. The Black Hawk War was complex in its origins, but its effect was the murder of hundreds of Native American civilians. Even storied heroes of American history like Abraham Lincoln participated in the Black Hawk War as militiamen, though Lincoln did not fight in any actual battles in the war. In the Battle of Bad Axe itself, steamboats were impressed by the federal government to attack Native Americans who were attempting to flee west across the Mississippi. It's likely that Abner's memory here is a callback to a particularly egregious action done by a steamboat by the name of Warrior, which fired cannons against the British band who were waving white flags in an attempt to surrender and try and save themselves from death. It had to be done as a rationalization that Abner thinks in this chapter when he thinks back to Bleeding Kansas and Bad Axe, but did it. Abner will later serve in the American Civil War for the Union side and become something of an abolitionist in his own thinking. But even as he's thinking more abolitionist ways and he's rejecting the ideology of slavery, he'll think It took a great deal of blood, Marsh reflected afterward bitterly. He seldom spoke about the war or his experiences in it, and had little patience with those who had fought the battles over and over again. There was a war, he would say loudly. We won. Now it's done with, and I don't see why we got to yammer about it endlessly like it was something to be proud of. Only good thing come out of that was ending slavery. The rest, I got no use for. Shooting a man ain't nothing but to brag on. God damn it. And I like that. I mean, I like that Abner thinks that war and killing aren't something to be especially proud of, but at least it ended slavery. So it's not that it's just a fully bad thing. It's a mostly bad thing that had one good endpoint. And given that this chapter revolves around blood and what it does to a man's thinking, it shades the very scenery of the Mississippi River. It invades dreams. It took a great deal of blood, in my opinion, as a mature way of understanding warfare, even if it's the most justified warfare possible. Defeating Nazism, rolling back slavery, it still has an impact on people, and it still ends people's lives, mostly for the bad, but sometimes for the good.
It doesn't erase the good that you do. It just understands the good that you do as this kind of fragile, flickering thing in context, right? That it's just like you hold to it, then you just zoom out and you look at all the blood and all that hadn't changed and all that wasn't changed, all that isn't changed coming out of any great possible moment for historical change. Like, we set Black people in America free. We set them free to be put in cages in Chicago and Philadelphia and New York and Boston. There's so much promise and hope that it could have come out of the Civil War that ended up getting rolled back. Yeah, especially in the South, but not only the South.
Right.
And so much of, so much of self-congratulating attitudes outside the South hinge on the South as this boogeyman that we're better than. We see that a lot in political discourse nowadays, especially when it comes to fighting over funding to the states with regards to the coronavirus crisis. And it's just this very convenient thing where because we can pretend that Kentucky is the only bad part of the United States, then suddenly Pennsylvania and Maine get off scot-free. And no, we absolutely do not. And that is, I think, part of Fever Dream and something George is aware of as someone who has, lived in the South but is not from the South, is from the Northeast. I think that's something that he is very conscious of and bringing to Abner Marsh's perspective. And that's why and how he's weaving real history into this book. Right.
And I think it's good that it's both a reflection on the American Civil War and on the horrors and the evils of slavery, which is participated primarily by the South, but also what happens in the North. As all of those heroes that we think about from the American Civil War, all the men who wore the blue uniforms, the Shermans, the Grants, all those folks, after the Civil War ended, they didn't fold up their uniform, went back to their homes and raised 20 children. They all went west and fought in the Indian Wars until they were basically done. And their and their descendants, ideological descendants, also fought in those Indian Wars going forward from there. So I think it's an important reflection that we have both of these two events that are occurring in Abner's mind. Both of these events are integral to the American experience and how it shaped us as a country that has issues, but also can be better ultimately in some senses, and then can still have the same issues 160 years after events from this chapter, which of course didn't happen because this is a fictional book, but still it has importance to the actual life and real things that are going on in America today.
Exactly. It's those two forces. It's a redemption and retrenchment. It's the progress and hope of the new man and same shit done over. And those two forces, I think, define American history, I think, between the two of them. And I think that is in its own humble way what Fever Dream is trying to do. And I think that's what makes it great.
Absolutely. So I think that about wraps us up for this episode on Fever Dream. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to those of you who are listening to our first ever Fever Dream live stream episode. We'll stick around probably for just a few minutes tonight. I think I gotta get up kind of early.
Yeah, just a couple questions for sure. Yeah. That'd be great.
Chat with you guys and see how things are going. If you guys had the chance, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, Podbean, Spotify, anywhere and everywhere you find our podcasts.
You can follow us on Twitter at NotAcastASOIAF or shoot us an email at NotAcastASOIAF@gmail.com. You can find me at Poor Quentin on Twitter or at PoorQuentin.com.
And you can find me at Brendan Beefish on Twitter, Brendan Beefish on Reddit, and my website is warsofpoliticsofficeinfire.wordpress.com. So join us next month for Chapter 10 of Fever Dream as Sour Billy Tipton reminisces about how David Julian took over the Garou plantation and then in the present watches him kill a former friend of Montreal. Really charming chapter. I love these Sour Billy chapters. They're horrifying.
It's going to make Chapter 9, this chapter, look like a lark by comparison. These Sour Billy chapters are always just staring straight into the abyss. Like the tension of the Abner chapters just gives way to just utter horror, and I love it.
I know you do, buddy. It's so much fun for you. And it's great. It's fun for me too. It's going to be a lot of fun. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much to all of you guys for supporting us every single month. We really, really appreciate it. And we will see you guys next time.
All right. Very good. Stop recording. Thanks so much for watching, folks.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Just going to go ahead and export this.
I see a lot of people are talking about that they're reading Fever Dream for the first time after being inspired by us, and we really appreciate it. This is actually, was this actually the first Martin book that you read after Song of Ice and Fire, or was this, or did you read something else first?
In terms of the full-length books?
Well, I mean, so outside of Song of Ice and Fire, Dug an Egg, and all that sort of stuff.
Oh, I've read his short stories before. I read Sand Kings before I read A Song of Ice and Fire, but I haven't read Dying of the Light, so...
You have not read Dying of the Light yet?
I've not read Dying of the Light yet.
Oh my goodness!
I've read chunks of it, but I've really liked what I know of it, so I still have to go through it. I'll get to it one of these days.
I mean, I'm going to sell it to you right now. It's George writing about his divorce from his first wife and putting in a science fiction fantasy context. It's super fucking melancholy. You'll love it.
I always love a wife guy text. That's the great thing about Temple of Doom. That the reason it's so angry and mean spirited is because Lucas and Spielberg are going through divorces. They're like, meh. Everything is angry and red, and children are being sacrificed, and women are mean. Meh. It's great. We're very immature as a species / gender specifically.
Mm-hmm. All right, Travis asks, the antebellum South and post-Civil War South is such a great period of time to set Fever Dream in. If George was to ever write another vampire story, what time period and place would you want it set?
Oh, I mean, well, that's the thing. Like, the obvious thing you say is crumbling European city, right? Like, I know, it's like Prague is the obvious answer for a reason, because vampires are so good at, like, detached elite aristocrats. That's why you set it there. But so, I don't know, maybe you go slightly into the future and have like late capitalism Singapore, like when that starts to fall apart. That system would be interesting, like kind of vaguely tech vampires in Singapore, or like Silicon Valley a generation from now. So like the Silicon Valley show, but they're vampires, and it's not
Westworld season 3 is what you're looking for. You want to put Damon, Julian, and
I refuse to believe Westworld is still on. You people are all joking me. Come on, who is watching that and why? But yeah, apparently, that. Go ahead.
I would say Tombstone, like set in the American West, right? Okay. So he starts the exploration of.
That would follow on this nicely. Civil War, then out west. That makes sense.
Yeah, because you have the issues with Native Americans, the expansion of America out west, the introduction of Chinese Americans, primarily Chinese people who are immigrating to California.
Okay,
that way. So I mean, you could see some interesting ways to,
for sure.
Do those things.
Deadwood with vampires. I would watch that.
Yeah, Deadwood would be also a really good spot for it too. I can imagine, and George loves Deadwood, so that would probably be perfect.
True. Anyone of good character loves Deadwood. It's arguably one of the best shows ever.
I've only seen a few episodes of it.
It's worth. It's that's another one where it's like it takes time. Deadwood's like you can't just watch it in the background. You have to pay attention. So it's a heavy one, but it's worth it.
Travis says he would do World War II Europe. Is he would go with, but he loves the answer from.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you watched Overlord?
No.
It's a World War II movie where the Nazis are doing like zombie vampire experiments.
Yeah,
it's recent. It's like a schlocky premise, but it's really well done. It came out a couple years ago. I definitely recommend it. I think it's available on Amazon.
Yeah. I'll take a look at it, baby. We'll see. All right, there's a Song of Ice and Fire question, which is fine. Feel free to ask a Song of Ice and Fire question. It's fine too. Think about POVs we're most looking forward to. Oh, okay. Here's a Fever Dream question. Am I the only one who later feels in the book a lot of gay tension, which is primarily between Joshua and Abner, but also not Joshua and Abner, primarily between Joshua and Damon, but also Damon and Joshua? Damon, did I say that twice? Damon and Abner. There we go.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, part of it is just like, when you write, well-dressed European dandy characters, you just kind of naturally tiptoe into broad gay stereotypes. I don't mean that in a negative way. That's just, in terms of popular fiction and shorthand, this is the territory you're working in. But he's also definitely directly playing it with Damon, which, I don't know if that's. I find that a little less interesting than someone like Renly, whose homosexuality is not connected to his villainy at all. Damon is a little just kind of part of the whole stereotype package. But yeah, I think that's definitely in there. I don't think it's developed much more than like a Disney villain gay tension kind of way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree. It's yeah, it's more like uncomfortable. It's intended to like make Abner feel uncomfortable, and also I think it's part of why he rejects it, because like Damon attempts to utilize like his ability to kind of mesmerize, like his vampiric mesmerism against Abner to try and convince him of the righteousness that he's actually right. In fact, we're not so different, you and I. You have, black
Spider-Man. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And this is the thing. The line between glamour and seduction is kind of thin. Like you can walk across that line as a writer, I think, without realizing that's what you're doing.
Yeah, agreed. All right, Mubarak M asks, okay, not as long as fire question. What would you do if you were in the trolley problem ethical scenario?
Isn't kill yourself what you're actually supposed to do? Or haven't smug, pretentious people figured this one out?
I think so. I think you're right, actually.
Throw yourself on the tracks, I think, is what you're supposed to say in this scenario. I don't know. I find the trolley problem kind of obnoxious. That's my answer.
You didn't like it? I mean, you
why
like
is it set up like this? Why are these people tied to the tracks? No. What's your answer?
Kill yourself, right? You gave me the smart answer, right?
Jump off and blame whoever tied the people to the tracks in the first place.
Right. You don't bear any moral culpability if that's the case.
Yeah. Screw these people.
All right. Micah says, "Hey, Micah, welcome." He says, "Sup, guys? Just popping because I still haven't read Fever Dream. Read Fever Dream. It's very good."
I like your red wall AV there. It's cute.
Yeah, that's is that new? That's cool. I like it. This is like so much more intimate having like 23 people here. It's fun. Someone asked us to rank Song of Ice, favorite Song of Ice and Fire POVs.
I mean, that's changes, depending on what we've done week to week. So
yeah, exactly. Like I feel like every single week this is my favorite chapter.
I mean, standard ones for me would be Davos, Catelyn, Theon, Gwenton, of course, Sansa, Bran.
Yeah. How about Clash? Since we're in Clash, what would be your favorite? What would be your top three so far?
Catelyn, Bran, and I mean Davos has only had one, so that would be cheating. And Theon, we just did another Theon one, so he's definitely up there. What about you?
I would say Catelyn, Bran, Tyrion. I mean, it's kind of
true. Yeah, no, can't go wrong there.
Can't go wrong with Tyrion. Yeah, I mean, all right. Barrel Raider asks, "What is the most horrific part of the book in your opinion, or gross?" I've got an easy answer to this, but I'll let you go first. Of Fever Dream, yeah.
Jeez. I mean, there's a lot of competitors for this one.
I think for me, it's when Damon Julian takes the black baby and cuts the arm off.
Yeah, that's hard to beat. I don't know. This is not the most. A lot of the most horrific stuff for me in Fever Dream isn't the direct bloodletting. It's like the little mindset stuff, like when Sour Billy thinks how kind he was to allow the slaves he's chaining up to be able to touch each other.
Right.
Like, stuff like that just like makes me like shrivel for days. It's like, he thinks he's being nice. Ugh. Yeah. That stuff hurts. I'm just like, I'm very like, I don't know. Gore doesn't really do anything to me anymore because I've just been staring at the shining elevator of blood like on repeat, like a loop behind my eyes since I was a child. But like emotional stuff like that, where horrible people think they're doing a kindness, but they're just being horrible. Like something about that, it's like a nail and like a nail under my fingernail. That haunts me.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think like it's that desensitization effect that violence has and stuff like that. I can see that. But I do
still like appreciate gore. And I still like go, oh God, how horrifying. But like it doesn't like blood doesn't haunt me anymore. Like just like emotional like deprivation and fucked upness. If that's a word in the English language, that haunts me for sure.
Guilty Undertaker brings up the point that the scene with him reminds of Jaime and Brienne being tied to facing each other.
That's a great comparison. It's the mockery of intimacy. That's what hurts me. It's like you're in love, kiss, you're in a horrible prison situation. Like, that mixture is what horrifies me.
It's like, what a sociopath thinks that like normal people like this is like intimacy, like
domesticity. It's like, oh God, no, make it stop. It's like Texas Chainsaw Massacre when they're all sitting around the dinner table while the prisoners are screaming. Like that's what that is, and that's just that's a nightmare.
Yep. Oh man, there's this stuff here.
Mm-hmm.
All right, what is your least favorite George R. Martin work from Samir? Tough Voyaging. I've been trying to get
Oh
through it.
yeah,
I've really had
right.
a really hard time. I got through the first story, and I'm like, this is fine. This is I'm not like
Yeah,
wowed by it.
the collection stuff don't do much for me. And yeah, as you said, they're weak. Sons of the Dragon is also not my favorite.
Sons of the Dragon. There we go. Yeah.
It counts in isolation.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that one's not good. Lakers Chone asks, which Song of Ice and Fire POV's chapters are you least familiar with? We were talking about this the other day. We were talking about like Shay's stuff from Tyrion's chapters, like
Right,
some of the
like
stuff from like
yeah,
Tyrion's mid
what happened
storm
to him
chapters.
there. And this is not even a marker on quality, but that's also true of Cersei's chapters in Feast for me. Like I don't remember which happens in which chapter. It's all I enjoy it all just because of how it's written, but it's not like here's the big event. Like the only big event in Cersei's chapters in Feast is the end when the Sparrow takes her down, and that's great and that's written perfectly. But like the first 9 chapters of Cersei in Feast is like Cersei does something kind of foolish. Wonder what's gonna happen next, folks. Check in next time with Cersei Lannister. The tone is brilliant, but it's not like the structure is just not like, you know, it's just like the boom.
Right. It's good. It's really, really good. I was thinking about this. Like there are chapters that I'm not like huge fans of. Not huge fans. I like the chapters, but they're not like they would never rank in my top. Like the Ironborn chapters for Feast for Crows, which I know like you love, which are great.
Yes,
but they're extremely memorable. Each and every chapter is extremely, extremely memorable, despite the fact that they're not like on the top of my list of chapters that I love. Although I am going to have to read them now over the next, couple weeks before we record our Forsaken episode.
That's true. We'll have to do a little bit at least.
But yeah, but I think, I think like Tyrion's chapters in Storm are like that. Arya's chapters in Storm until we get to Beric and Darien, I think are like
that's
that.
a big jump because her first few in Storm are like start to drag a bit, but then as soon as Beric shows up, the quality jumps through the roof. So that's a pretty big jump.
Yeah, but so it's all good.
All right, I'll take a couple more.
Yeah, let's do 2 more and then we'll call it a night, I think. If you go with that.
Good.
All right. Song of Ice and Fire Geek U asks, do you think the fall of the wall and the burning of Shireen happened in the Wind's Winter or Dream of Spring? And whose POV do we see the fall of the wall? Also, what's up with Alistair Thorne? Do we see Euron flowing the horn or no? That's like 5 questions in one. Way to like sneak all those questions in at the very end.
I hope those things happen at the end of Winds of Winter because I think that they should be dealt with. The fall of the wall and the burning of Shireen. If there's room for them to be in the winds, they should be the climactic events. In terms though, if Euron blowing the horn, Sam is the POV in Old Town. So whatever extent we see that, I think is through his. As far as the fall of the wall goes, Bran's easy for that just because he has magic.
Yeah,
can see everywhere. Melisandre or Jon, if they're still in the area, could also be possibilities.
There was a recent revelation by Ted Naismith, who's one of the artists for Song of Ice and Fire, in which he was talking about one of the paintings he did for George R. Martin, in which he said he'd painted Eastwatch by the Sea, and he submitted it over to George, and George's like, "Hey, this is great and all, but this is not exactly how I've imagined Eastwatch by the Sea. I've got a different idea for it, but I haven't written it yet, but it will be in a future book. So I do wonder whether Eastwatch by the Sea will be similar to what we saw at the end of season 7 from Game of Thrones, which is where the actual fall of the wall, we'll see it through a POV, whether it's who's over at Eastwatch by the Sea now. Because everyone's
it's Alistair Thorne's cronies in charge there, isn't he?
Yeah, that would be fun. Have him as like an epilogue guy. What if Alistair
Sure. Yeah, exactly. That'd be funny.
Yep. That's a cool idea. Guilty Undertaker, who's MVP over here, says, I like to see the horn blown scene from several POVs like the Common, like a Rorschach block test. That would be awesome.
You do Euron and then Bran and then Dany could have a vision of it. That'd be fun.
All right. Let's do one last question if I can find one. Kyle HS. After Fever Dream, can we get a chapter by chapter of it? The people deserve this.
I would love that, but I don't know if it's fair to make Jeff put Jeff.
I've never read it. I've never.
I'm sure there was some stuff in there you would absolutely love, and then there was some stuff in there that you would find awkward to read or just interminable. So that would, it would vary tremendously. But it is one of my all-time favorites, so I would love to do something about that at some point. whether it's with you or by myself, or I'll kidnap someone and force them to do it with me. I'll make Grant do it. I know he's a Stephen King fan.
Yeah,
But,
Grant or Vanessa. Vanessa's a big Stephen King fan.
true.
I think she has a podcast going through it, right? Or is that what she's doing with
Oh right, yeah, I forgot about that. That's true. We should check out Vanessa's instead. She's
Yeah.
a bit better than I would anyway. But yeah, I'll make Chloe read it. That would be a terrible thing for me to do. Put that poor soft-hearted girl. So pure. I know Chloe's a boss, but she is a pure, like, fawn from the woods when it comes to horror.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not her domain.
I mean, I will finish Fever Dream in what, like about a year and a half or so at the pace we're going at. How many chapters is it?
I don't know. It's it might take us a little longer than that, but I'm in for the ride.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see what happens like 2 years from now.
Exactly.
There are 35 chapters to include the epilogue.
Okay, so then we got a couple more years to go then.
Yeah, so we got a little bit of time. So we're on chapter 10. No, 9. Right. So
right on.
Yeah, 2 years or so before we're going into that. We'll have to make that decision about our next book.
Exactly. Got plenty of time.
Mm-hmm. All right, guys. Well, we really appreciate everyone tuning in. Again, we do these episodes for you folks who are listening in for the first time every month as another one of our bonus Patreon-only episodes. And again, this episode will be available next week, I think, for all of our patrons. So if you guys have the chance, check us out at patreon.com/Outcast ASOF, where you can find all of the good stuff we normally talk about. Again, we really appreciate so many of you guys supporting us. And yeah, we really appreciate it. And we're going to be doing The Forsaken next for our next, the first of 4 parts for The Forsaken at the end of this month.
Going to be delightful to bring you that. Can't wait to get our teeth into The Forsaken. One of many.
Mm-hmm. See you guys.